Okay, thanks a lot. I'm not going to talk much about myself, although I can assure you, I'm my favorite topic. But I'll refrain from introducing myself very long. Sometimes in Germany I'm confronted with the allegation that I was a so-called Putin understander. But I can assure you that I have finished roughly as many university courses as Mrs. Baerbock has dropped out of. And on the other side, you may hear it, I have been learning English in Britain, concretely in Glasgow, and not in the Ajoie or in Porrentruy. And if you're informed about the current Swiss cabinet, you may know who I'm talking about. Apart from that, I have not only read Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, but I have been observing how diplomacy and military work together in crisis situations on a daily basis. During the 6 years that I spent in the OSCE in Vienna and on the ground in Ukraine and Nagorno-Karabakh. And I have come to the conclusion that nowadays armed forces are there to re-establish an acceptable status under international law after a disruption of the order. And they have to do so with the mildest means available. So countries that implement the rules-based orders with means of nuclear weapons are probably the same countries that would dissolve an illegal meeting with means of machine gun fire. What the international order is or should be is rather clear. It's not the rule-based order that Mr. Borrell is permanently talking about, but it is the Charter of the United Nations of San Francisco in 1945, which was the result of 2 world wars. And I think we should not allow our European governments to throw that order over at wish. Fine, so much for that. And now the current situation in Ukraine. And I'm proceeding according to this agenda. The very big picture, you know, is the one that we are currently in a global stalemate in which everybody is dependent on each other, and no one actually can act unilaterally. We see that Russia currently is unable to persuade the United States to have serious talks, among others, about Ukraine. The US cannot deal with the situations in the Middle East and in Ukraine and in the Far East without Russia and Iran. As far as the Middle East is concerned, Russia cannot continue its efforts without the support of the BRICS Plus countries, and the US cannot pose a threat to China without the consent of Russia, and they can in particular not deal with the situation in and around Taiwan under these circumstances. And I'm sure we will see it on the Bürgenstock that Ukraine cannot draw other countries into a war against Russia on its side. We are seeing that the Bürgenstock conference will not be a peace conference. I think there's general consent about that. And therefore, a fundamental change of the situation is very unlikely. And at the same time, you know, we are told fairy tales from Brussels. One of the big contradictions is the freedom of choice of a nation which alliance it wants to be part of. It is sometimes said that this was one of the Helsinki principles of 1975. This is not true. The freedom of choice of an alliance is not a principle enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act 1975. And that was the conference that overcame the Cold War. On the other side, Russia is always talking about the what is it called, like the indivisibility. That security is not to be divided. That everybody has equal rights on security, and that is a principle enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act. And part of the problems, of course, come from the fact that, to put it mildly, NATO is not used to respect the security interests of other actors in global policy, but is rather used to deal with that question unilaterally. And we see now with the so-called rules-based order that they want to implement worldwide, and the rules of which they define themselves without taking into account the Charter of the United Nations. As long as a NATO membership of Ukraine is an option, this war cannot be ended, and Mr. Putin can tell whatever he wants. In an interview with Tucker Carlson, saying that a possible NATO membership of Ukraine was not the reason for his actions after the 24th of February 22, because it was the question that drove decisions, and it was the question that have been sorted out or mentioned in the Istanbul peace or ceasefire draft agreement that has never been implemented. So NATO is probably not the solution to the conflict, but one of the reasons, and we should keep that in mind. For the time being, the military situation is not favorable, of course, for Ukraine. Since they left Avdiivka, they were compelled to withdraw permanently, and the Russians advanced steadily but surely, taken a nameless village every day. By the way, villages, I've seen some of these villages that were contested from 2014 on, such as Pesky or Pisky, as the Ukrainians called it. That was completely devastated. There's nothing left. And I think many of the places that we are talking about now just look the same. And I've been to all these places. I've been to Stanitsa Luhanska. I've been to Kramatorsk and Severodonetsk and all these places. And I'm afraid that there's not a lot left of what I've seen in the years between 2014 and 2020 when I used to travel there. What you see on the left here is the area of Orikhiv or Orikhov in Russian. You see the front line of January the 6th, 2023. That was before the so-called Ukrainian summer offensive, and in light red you see the current situation, and you see that the results of the Ukrainian summer offensive of 2023 are almost nullified. And I have warned against the belief that the Ukrainians could now easily beat the Russians, because I've seen the Ukrainian army on the ground. I've seen, or I've experienced and seen the Russian forces from inside for more than a year, and I can assess what these forces are capable to do, and I know the geography, and I can only warn now NATO against believing that beating Russia would be an easy trick. That can be very, very costly. And you mentioned it, Alec, people or press and media products such as the Blick, they're trying to tell us that victory against Russia can be achieved easily. And they don't just say it like that. They say it because they want to draw us into a war against Russia by saying, look, it's easy. We'll travel to Ukraine, we'll beat the Russians within a month, and everything will be okay. I can only warn against that. And the second that I want to tell you with this slide is that in this war, a fundamental change with military means and methods only is not possible any longer. Both forces have shown what they're capable of. I think the Russians, they have some reserves. The Ukrainians have hardly any reserves. The Europeans, I think they have delivered what they can deliver. And we need, as a result of that, a strategy of talks, of negotiations, and I would not agree at the time being with Mrs. Baerbock that this war has to be sorted out on the ground by the military. This is not possible any longer, and it was not possible from the beginning. I've said it for years. The Russians can't take over militarily the entire Ukraine. The country is too big. The armed forces of Ukraine at the beginning of 2022, they were too strong. Please don't tell me that the Russians are now capable of overrunning the whole of Western Europe. They can't. I've been there. I know what they have. I know what they can. But what they can, and you see it on the right, is they can expand the front against Ukraine a bit if they want to, and that's what they've been doing a couple of days ago by starting military operations in the Sumy area, continuing, of course, the war of attrition that is going on. And as far as Europe is concerned, we have no leadership. This does not only apply to Europe. I know the leadership, I know the crew in the Bundeshaus East as well. I've been serving together with Thomas Süßli when he still was a captain. I have been introduced to Viola Amherd. I know Pelvi Pulli. I know Markus Meder since he was a captain. And I can assure you there's no capability of working out strategy of negotiations worth calling it that way. And in his statements of about the difference between the rules-based order and the law of the jungle, mentioned by Josep Borrell, he implicitly laid claim to a leading role of the European Union in global politics. and a leading role would require superior quality in not only in military affairs, but in diplomacy, and having worked together with diplomats from 57 OSCE participating states in Vienna, I can assure you that the quality of Western European diplomacy, as well as the diplomats of the US State Department, are not superior to that of diplomats of the other half of the states participating in the OSCE. On the contrary, when I look at the level of language, the knowledge that they do have, I find that diplomats from the former Soviet Union, particularly from the Caucasus region and from Central Asia, they are much better than Western European diplomats, but I'm happy to say they are not as arrogant as the Western Europeans are. So, looking at the Bundeshaus East reminds me of the book Glaube wird Soldat. Those of you who have read in their youth Glaube books, they know what I think of, and I think the right one is self-explanatory. No leadership, no more confidence. I've watched it myself. I've watched I would call it the destruction of the system of arms control and of confidence and security building measures. When I was in Vienna, the abolition, of course, of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, that was much earlier than I was in Vienna. Maybe you remember that was due to 9/11. The Americans dropped out of the ABM treaty, and the Russians accepted it, and you know what happened afterwards. Of course, when I was still in the Armed Forces Command Staff in Bern, seeing that the Europeans de facto dropped out of the Conventional Forces Europe Treaty, which was, by the way, signed at a time when the Soviet Union already didn't exist any longer, and people thought, why should we adhere to a contract that has been signed when one of the main contractors was already not existing any longer? I have in Vienna experienced what happened to the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and I'm fully aware of the fact that we'll never get an INF-like treaty any longer on medium-range ballistic missiles. And I have seen what happened to the Open Skies Treaty that allowed OSCE participating states to conduct inspections in the airspace of everybody else in the OSCE to control, to monitor military activities, and that at a very short time, you know, 48 hours. 48 hours is for the VD, the Vienna document, has the same functions for the Vienna document. That means short time inspections of military activities, and I've seen how the West, how NATO, under the leadership of the United States, misused the Vienna document. I unfortunately can't exclude the Federal Republic of Germany from that allegation. They have contributed to that as well. You may remember the mission in the Donbass when under the Vienna document, German officers conducted an inspection in the Donbass that had nothing to do with the idea of confidence building, but that was purely about spying on the forces of the Donetsk and the Lugansk People's Republics. It was a misuse. I've seen how the US Defense Attaché in Vienna, Jules Silberberg, by the way, organized a permanent presence of NATO officers in Ukraine. That was never the idea of the Vienna document. I've seen these officers in the Grand Hotel Ukraina in Dnipropetrovsk, today Dnipro, and I've heard Canadian officers briefing the audience in the Forum for Security Cooperation in Vienna about what they saw during this inspection. There was a briefing about events in Nikolaev. But remember, they were in Dnipropetrovsk, I don't know, is it 200 or 300 kilometers away? Confronted with the allegation that it is impossible that he's seen that with his own eyes. He had to admit it was just what he heard, what they told him. So maybe these treaties, these agreements would all have to be substantially revised nowadays, because technology is developing, and some of them may have become useless, such as the Open Skies treaties, because today with reconnaissance satellites, of course, you can get the same information on the ground without sending airplanes into somebody else's airspace. But it was all a system that created a minimum of mutual confidence, because we knew that the Russians would adhere to the INF and the Americans would, and there was a monitoring regime for each and every of these international agreements, and this monitoring regime has gone with the treaty itself. So we have no confidence at the time being, and we have no means of restoring this system of mutual confidence, and we have no platforms either. If I hear from the colleagues in Vienna how discussions in the Forum for Security Cooperation and in the Permanent Council are being conducted, I am just shocked, you know. It's not a discussion any longer. Everybody turns up in the Neue Saal in the Hofburg and reads down the instructions he or she got from the capital, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then the guys leave. And they let other delegations do the same, and that's not my understanding of a discussion. It is a wee bit better now. Until a couple of months ago, European Union diplomats used to leave the premises when a Russian diplomat started speaking. And it's pretty difficult to start a discussion in these circumstances. They even don't use the lift, the elevator, if a Russian diplomat is inside. Fine. Stair walking is good for your heart. I don't mind. But this sounds a bit, you know, like a kindergarten. Just to avoid the F word, which Mrs. Newland is so fond of, as it was mentioned. And we have no means to monitor or even implement a ceasefire agreement or a peace agreement. I've made the experience with a special monitoring mission to Ukraine that OSCE created in spring 2014. being the senior planning officer of this mission in Kiev in the autumn of 2014. And the Minsk agreements, Minsk 1 and 2, Minsk package of measures, could not be implemented, or at least the military provisions of the MMP, the Minsk measures, or package of measures, could not be implemented because SMM was unable to monitor it. When the forces started to withdraw the heavy weapons from the contact line, the SMM was unable to monitor it. So the artillery guns and the tanks, they vanished somewhere. We don't know where they went to. And we had, for 6 years, no chance to monitor where they were. They just popped up somewhere. If we want to create a status of military balance in the east of Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine, NATO would probably have, or somebody else would probably have, to send forces to Ukraine in the size of several divisions to create a status of equilibrium, because we know that the Russians can deploy and maintain a force of the size of 10 divisions on their side. So, of course, we would wish that on the other side there were 10 divisions as well. If we can agree on that everybody is allowed to have one division, that would be great, of course, but again, we can't implement it. We just would have to believe people what they say, and we would not even be capable of monitoring the line of contact entirely, as this, as you see here, would require a force, a division-size force as well. We in Europe, we just haven't got it, and the Swiss haven't got it, and the Irish haven't got it, and everybody else whom I trust to a certain extent, they haven't got it. And the peacekeeping force deployed by NATO is, of course, a no-go for Russia, and I don't see a chance that NATO is getting a mandate for a peacekeeping mission in eastern Ukraine by the UN Security Council, bearing in mind what happened since 1999. So, if there was a set of ideas for a ceasefire agreement, how would we have to implement it? How would we have to phrase it? And it was after 2015 that I started working on a roadmap for the Minsk package of measures. And I did so on behalf of the permanent representative of Switzerland to the OSCE. At that time, it was Ambassador Claude Wild, later serving as Swiss ambassador to Kiev. And I mentioned at the beginning, in the introduction, that we have to come back to, or that the forces have to re-establish an acceptable order under international law. And the last status accepted, widely accepted, that was the Minsk package of measures, the MPM of February 2015. And the draft ceasefire agreement of Antalya or Istanbul in March 2022 was not accepted, but had a fair chance of being accepted by the world community. So these are the two stepping stones I'm working with. And you can see the detailed provisions of these agreements on the slide here. So we started working on that, and as a first step we thought about the interdependence of the various provisions of the Minsk Agreement. Which one of these provisions depends on another provision, and where are no links between two provisions, and that was solely about real interdependencies. We are not talking about diplomats trying to make provisions a bargain chip so they can deal with it, they can deal for something else with it. No, it was just about, you know, a logic link between two provisions. So that was step number one. Step number two was to establish the priorities of the different provisions. Which one seems more important to us than others? Of course, you can discuss endlessly about it, but you have to do this step. The step three was about the requirements. Which provision is a prerequisite for the implementation of another of these points, of these prescriptions in the Minsk package of measures. That gave us the possibility to establish the phasing of the implementation of the different provisions, and as a result we were able to present as a result a phasing for the implementation, and that was the point where we stopped, and we did not go as far as establish the accompanying measures in the field of foreign policy, diplomacy, internal policy, economy and military. And of course, in each and every of these 6 phases, we would need provisions in the field of diplomacy, military, economy, etc., etc., so that in each and every of these phases, every party to the conflict has to implement something, but has or can expect to have provisions implemented by the opposite side in their favor, so that the peace process cannot be interrupted at any time. It is always a matter of giving something in order to be on the receiving end at the same time. And the end of it, the end state is, of course, an end state that observes the principles of the Montevideo Big Four, the Big Four conditions for the existence, for the mere existence of a state, such as population, territory, the constitutional state of a country, and foreign relations. And in addition to that, we would have to have a state of balance on the military field, economic field, and other fields. So that sounds a bit like work, and it has taken weeks and months for us to establish that roadmap, and we could now repeat the same exercise on the basis of Alfred de Zaya's blueprint for peace. You may have heard about it. He's published it. I think Alek has provided you with Alfred de Zaya's thoughts, his food for thought paper. Repeat the same exercise and come to a desired end state. That would require discussions not between representatives of governments, because nobody is giving his negotiating strategy away, but with experts who are capable of assessing the interests of the states they are living in. Of course, we would have to talk about each and every of these steps I've mentioned before with the governments involved. We would have to have consultations on it. Of course, that would take months, but this is the only way to achieve acceptance by the governments involved. This as well means a lot of work, but the main takeaway for you should be that there is a method to assess a situation, to analyze a mission, to establish a roadmap. We've tried it out. We've tried it out in the OSCE high-level planning group. One of the officers, having served with me, is still working in the HLPG. There's Major Bieliavsky from the Russian Federation, Lieutenant Colonel McCarthy from the Irish Defence Force. Unfortunately, have left, but we have worked on that for weeks and months. It is a lot of acribic work, a lot of analyzing, a lot of data gathering, information gathering, analysis. It would take weeks and months, but it is possible if only there was the political will, and that's what's lacking at the time being. As the US certainly decided to make use of the desire of Ukraine to be useful to the West by fighting Russia. They promised a lot. They said they would beat Russia strategically, that they would parade their tanks in Moscow and in Sevastopol, and the West was happy to believe Zelensky, as he was happy to believe Poroshenko. I've come to this conclusion on the basis of what I observed 6 years long in Vienna, and on the ground that it was not NATO or the US that pushed Ukraine into a war. I think it's rather the contrary. Various Ukrainian administrations drew the West into a conflict with Russia. I've seen Yatsenyuk in Kiev. I've seen Geoff Pyatt, at the time the US ambassador in Kiev. I've not seen Turchinov. I've seen Poroshenko. I haven't seen Zelensky, but the circumstances which this war started under tells me that this is the case as well. And NATO and the West, they have promised the Ukrainians quite a lot, and they are not keeping their promises at the time being. So what could the way ahead be? It is my observation that at the time being, the front line between the fighting forces has changed everywhere, with the exception of Toretsk, northeast and northwest of Donetsk. That's the place where the front line is still where it was from 2015 on. And I'm quite sure that under the threat of shelling of cities by Ukrainian artillery and missiles, the Russians wish to have a strip of territory, let's say 20 kilometers wide, between the major cities of the Donbass and the Ukrainian armed forces. And definitely this is not the case in Donetsk. And by the way, Novhorodsk here, a town under control of the Ukrainian armed forces until the present day, has been renamed. It's now New York. So if you hear about fighting in New York in the future, stay calm. It's a different kind of New York. And it would be fairly difficult for the Russians to storm these hills with the remnants of what they dug out in the mines. And you see every one of these wee triangles is a coal mine or whatever mine. So I think the Russians will try to take New York and Donetsk either by force, or they would demand these places to be demilitarized and under international control if a ceasefire agreement was signed. And that will be one of the big problems, of the big obstacles for future negotiations. And I could even imagine that we need a new ceasefire line, a new line of contact along obstacles in the terrain such as rivers, because I've seen in the years 2015 to 2020 the front running across big cities. The front line was, or line of contact as we called it, was running along the eastern borders of the city of Donetsk. This is definitely not acceptable, because sporadic fighting that may break out will always affect a lot of civilians, and we're under no illusions. You know, we have seen in Nagorno-Karabakh a ceasefire agreement in power, you know, and we're fully aware of the fact that there will always be a soldier, a young man, 19 years old, 20 years old, who in the middle of the night feels or perceives a threat and starts firing off his rifle. That's okay so far, because the experience told us that the huge damage on property is inflicted by heavy weapons, by artillery, by tanks. The majority of victims, military and civilian victims, is caused by heavy weapons. So as long as artillery and tanks are under control, we'll be happy, and we'll discuss, of course, about Private Brown firing off his rifle late at night. That's okay. We'll get that sorted out, but the real trouble starts when people are starting to use artillery. And we knew, of course, having served in forces ourselves, that artillery is not firing just because a young soldier decides to fire his guns. There's always a political will behind it, because you're not just touching and not firing individually. So maybe drawing a contact line across along rivers or other obstacles in the terrain, but I don't see any other type of obstacles in this terrain than rivers, would help to monitor and to observe a ceasefire. And the thing that worries us, or worried us most in the high-level planning group, was the deployment of automated fighting systems such as UAVs, drones on the right-hand side, and automated ground systems in the war in Donbass and northeast of DFK. We know that automated ground systems, fighting robots, were used a couple of weeks ago, and we were so much worried, concerned by this, because it is not only a question of machines killing human beings, but these systems give somebody the possibility to start a war with impunity, because a fighting force, of course, might lose soldiers. Soldiers might be killed and you want the body back, or they might be captured and you want the POWs back. But this does not apply to machines. So you can easily risk the existence of a few machines, and you can even try to conceal the origin of your fighting machines. And there's a lot of possibilities how to conceal that, so that at the end of the day nobody has a proof that you were violating the ceasefire agreement. So you can start a war with impunity, and that is something that we should keep an eye on in the future. And what is now happening between NATO and Russia can be forecasted or explained by the use of a morphological box. So, of course, Russia can, as a response to Belgorod being shelled by choosing a target on US territory, NATO territory, the high seas or space contested territory, or of course the territory of Ukraine. They can define the kind of target that they want to hit. They can choose whether they want to act openly or covertly. They can choose a location easy to access or hard to access, for instance, for international investigators. Of course, they can decide whether they want to make use of nuclear weapons or conventional weapons. A good way, a good method at the time being, unfortunately, is the use of diffuse kind of weapons, weapons of which you don't see the effect immediately, and the origin of which is hard to prove. Electronic warfare is an example for that. And of course, they can decide whether they want to use regular forces or proxies or private military companies. So at the time being that the West is playing kind of a chicken game with nuclear weapons, the Russian side has still a wide variety of methods they can respond with, and that's what made me calm the temper a bit down when I was, or calm the situation a bit down when I was talking to a couple of American specialists a couple of days ago. They say we are on the brink of a nuclear war. But I said, if we haven't had a nuclear war yet now, it is due to the fact that the Russian Federation has a lot of methods to answer to NATO provocations, and the fact that they are cool-minded. I don't know how long this will be the case any longer, because everybody's saying, Putin, you don't dare use nuclear weapons, might provocate him to make a demonstration that he can. So, the next incident could start somewhere along the big routes of maritime transport or ground transport, if you want, near the centers where the majority of the population is living of the world. Of course, they're free to choose the time when they want to launch their response. You know, we know that Macron will make a big deal about the Olympic Games in Paris. Chancellor Scholz will make a big deal with the opening of the European Football Championship. The NATO summit in Washington is a point in time where you can place a response. And the federal elections, the presidential elections in the United States in general. And of course, you could launch a response action at a place with in a country with low political stability, or in a country with a high terror threat anyway. So I'm expecting an answer of Russia's to the shelling of Belgorod and other incidents, and to the shelling or to attacks on strategic installations in Russia in the near future. And I have a couple of ideas where and when it could happen. I'm predicting it. I don't wish it to be, but I tell you, it will happen. And due to the fact that the conflict now is becoming more and more a conflict between Russia and NATO, tells us that there should be a way out for Ukraine, out of a global conflict that it has maneuvered itself into it after 2014, and just stop the bloodshed in Ukraine, stop the devastation of the country, and leave NATO and Russia fight each other somewhere else, but not in Ukraine. But again, establishing peace is hard work. It's not just done by nice words in politicians' speeches, but it is a result of hard work by military and diplomatic personnel. To sum it up, I hardly expect an incident during the Bürgenstock conference, because the Bürgenstock conference of next weekend is just not important enough. But I'm expecting a hot summer. I'm hoping that the focus will go from Ukraine elsewhere. I warn you not to underestimate Russian determination. The Russians have the impression that they are fighting NATO and that they are fighting powers that want to destroy Russia, that want to smash Russia into pieces. There are political powers that want to detach Siberia, the North, the South, the Caucasus, etc., Kamchatka, etc., from Russia, and forces that want to create a number of smaller states on the today Russian territory, divided into small political entities that they can easily control politically and they can easily control economically. That's what they have tried. That's what they've done in the 90s with Russia. That's what they have done with Ukraine. Alek has been talking about arable land in Ukraine, and that's, by the way, what they want to try with Belarus under the present circumstances just as well. Ivan ante portas, I think that warnings of NATO Secretary General, but warnings of the chief of defense of Switzerland, that the Russians might, in 2 weeks' time, stand in the Entlebuch or somewhere else. The pure propaganda. I know what the Russian forces are capable to do. It is too early to talk about a European security architecture, but I'm quite sure whatever it is, it would have to be based on mutual respect. We have to respect that Russia is different. The Russians are not Californians, and they don't want to be Californians or Swedes or Norwegians, and I see no reason why we should compel them to do so. So mutual respect. Russia is Russia, China is China, the Europeans are Europeans. Some of them want the LGBTI values, others don't. Some of them are more religious than others. Some of them have a bit different idea about economy in their country than others. Some of them just don't want to sell out their economy to Western investors. That's all okay. Without the mutual respect for that, we will not achieve a stable European architecture of security. And I can only repeat it, ending the bloodshed is hard work. We need serious people to work on that, and I don't see these serious people in the West now. They have no idea of the difficulties of establishing peace. They're unable to do so. Continuing a war is far easier for them. Question whether we should again elect such people, I leave that to you. I won't. And I said it the other day to a television station, I won't be marching towards the Volga River for Angela Merkel's new values or the LGBTI, etc. values. I just won't. This is not worth risking a worldwide thermonuclear war. So I hope you agree on that, and you can shell me with questions now. Yeah, please.
Hello. Two Swiss guys as the duty in Donbass, Alexander Hook and Tony Frisch. What do you think? Have they delivered a proper work?
Definitely. Definitely. Of course, Alexander Hook was under criticism from the locals in the Donbass, as well as the special monitoring mission did not provide the Donbass with the results we would have wanted, or they would have wanted. But I've been talking to Alexander Hook many times. He was under tremendous pressure. He was not allowed to say everything that he wanted to say, but I think he tried to be the honest broker. And the same applies to Tony Frisch, who, whenever he was in Vienna, turned up in my office. Of course, he was not an easy deal for the president of the Trilateral Contact Group, Martin Seidig at the time, a very impulsive person, but he was determined to produce concrete results on the ground, but was not allowed to. And has a lot to do with the reasons why Martin Seidig resigned as the president of the Trilateral Contact Group, and why Heidi Tagliavini did not want to continue this work, and why Heidi Grau dropped out of the Trilateral Contact Group, because they understood at a certain point in time that there was no political will for peace, that everybody wanted to keep open an option for a military solution to the conflict, and they understood that it is no use negotiating once a week with people who don't really want to negotiate. And we are still there. We are still in that phase, unfortunately.
Yes. During the recent SPF conference in St. Petersburg, journalist asked Mr. Putin, what would it take to have peace with Ukraine? And he referred to both the Minsk agreements and the Istanbul agreement, which was never signed, but was ready to be signed. I think it was Boris Johnson who intervened and said, don't sign it or something like that, more or less. Anyway, Mr. Putin's answer was, yes, Istanbul would be a good basis to start, but there would be quite a few items to be added to it. He was not specific. Could you elaborate on that? Would you know what he meant with more items to be added to Istanbul?
Well, one item is surely the International Court of Justice with his order of arrest against Vladimir Putin himself as a person. Of course, that problem has to be sorted out. The problems of war crimes committed on both sides, by the way, from 2014 on, has to be sorted out as well. And I can surely tell you, and we have confronted the Ukrainian delegation a couple of times in Vienna with allegations of war crimes committed by the UAF. These would have to be sorted out on either side. That's another problem that has not been mentioned in the draft ceasefire agreement in Istanbul. We need to talk about unmanned aerial vehicles, drones. We need to talk about standoff weapons. They were not used at the time when they were talking about the ceasefire. They would have to talk about automated fighting systems, etc., etc. Thus, I can roughly imagine what Vladimir Putin was thinking about when mentioning this. And another big issue, of course, is the lack of confidence and the belief that Ukraine and the West would only make use of a period of ceasefire to rearm Ukraine in order to prepare themselves for starting the fighting again. So we would have to have guarantees for that in a ceasefire agreement. And the ban on weapons deliveries that Alfred Zayas has mentioned is not enough, because Ukraine is not in a position to produce weapons any longer, or large numbers of sophisticated weapons. Russia is. On the other hand side, we have to take into account that Russia has 15 or 16 neighbors, that a threat to Russia could come from somewhere else than from Ukraine. So it would be pretty difficult to set up guarantees for the security of Russia, knowing that Russia has, as I said, 15 or 16 neighbors from Europe to the Far East. So that's certainly the practical difficulties of a ceasefire agreement or peace agreement that Mrs. Baerbock and others are not even dreaming about at the time being. Hard work here as well.
I mean, what you just said about using the ceasefire to rearm is a real danger.
Of course.
Madame Merkel has exactly said the truth about what happened between 2014 and 2022. So I think this is maybe the strongest point behind. I suspected so, but of course you mentioned many others. And yeah, thank you very much. Helpful.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for sharing your information. With us, I really prefer get experience from guys that have the boots on the ground. Or you hear some information from guys sitting on the sofa and got sharing this, what they see on YouTube and other channels. I'm not on a diplomatic side, neither on military. I'm an independent contractor for a civil construction or more little bit infrastructures. So I got some experience in Africa, such as Eastern Congo, Rwanda, and the biggest experience I got by myself was in South Sudan. So first of all, I like to express my disappointment what got on of the Bürgenstock. Since in Bürgenstock was the peace agreement signed for South Sudan, and then I got moved on after this because our country manager got kidnapped. So I was there over 2 years non-stop, building the international airport, where the main port, and then also the beginning port. And I really like you mentioned the Montevideo Big Four constitution. That was the main thing. So they got independence after the referendum. And now my question is, since you got experience on the Russian side, I have only worked with Russians in the oil business. I can agree with you, they're very focused. If they get a goal, they go for it. Mm-hmm. And since I got some experience with civil and guerrilla tactic wars, they say if you go in a country, usually you have to bring 6 guys to kill one on the other side. And I don't know, you experience the numbers in Russia. So that's pretty much ordinary troops. They're not tactics like I figured out with guys in the bush coming out. They got some methods I really don't like to mention here. And the other thing is, looking forward, I really like also your outline. What do you think for the future, for the private investors there? Is it already cut off the cake? Like with the big investors, we also got some names on it. Since some American investors, they will share up, cut off the Ukrainian resources. As we know, they're a breadbasket of Europe. And in Africa, it's also all about resources like oil, minerals, gold. What do you think about this infrastructure, resources, basically economical cases? I really would like to hear from you. What is your outlook there? Thank you.
You know, arable land is not the only issue, and is not the only wealth of Ukraine. Ukraine had a high standard of technology. Maybe you remember that space missiles were constructed in Dnipropetrovsk. Dnipropetrovsk used to be a high-tech area. They have raw material. We've heard that. Principally, Ukraine is a very wealthy country. What's happening now is that it is taken under economic control by the West. This does not only apply to arable land, it applies to the debt of Ukraine at the time being, because the weapons that they have been provided with, they will have to pay one day. So that way the West has made sure that Ukraine will be dependent and remain dependent on the West for decades to come. And one of the reasons why I think that a complete change of alliances in the case of Ukraine is possible is exactly this dependency of Ukraine on the West. If they want to get rid of it, if they want to gain control of their arable land, of their industry, of their financial sector, again, they would have to tell the West that they're absolutely not prepared to pay for what they got from the West. And they cannot afford to do that without the support of the BRICS, particularly Russia and China. So the idea of taking Ukraine under control by economic means, that could terribly backfire. And in fact, I hope it will backfire, because I would like to see an economically, politically independent Ukraine in the future as well. country that is trying to establish reasonably good relationships with either side, with the West and the East, and what's happening now is the opposite of it, and it's a rough case, but I think that leading politicians in Ukraine are economically, financially so dependent now on the West that they can't just change the course. Well, that's another strategy that I have observed not only in Ukraine, and there's a strategy that is being applied on Switzerland at the time being as well, by the way. And here we are back at democracy. That was a long session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.